and welcome everyone to the second in a series of 3 spring lectures by the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies. We have today an extraordinary individual, Dr. Pedro Gonzalez Corona. I have known Pedro as a student and as a colleague. I had the great pleasure of traveling with Pedro to Jerusalem, where he gave an amazing talk at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And he continues to live up to that world-class stature as a young scholar. He's a visiting assistant professor at UT Dallas. He's taught both undergraduate and graduate courses on the ideas of race and human rights. He was a visiting scholar in 2018 at the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism at Oxford University. He currently serves on the International Board of Academic Advisors for that institute. Very prestigious institute. It is global, as its name indicates. Dr. Gonzalez Corona earned his PhD in History of Ideas from UT Dallas in 2019. His dissertation was titled Genealogy of Racism in Mexico, Technological Devices of Race and Their Transformation in Modern Mexico. So Dr. Gonzalez Corona is an authority on human rights, issues of race, anti-Semitism in Latin America, and please join me to welcome him today, Dr. Pedro Gonzalez Corona.
Thank you, Dr. Patterson. That was a nice presentation. I hope I can measure up to your words and present something meaningful to you all. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Dr. Romer, Cindy, and everyone else here. I need to say that I'm presenting from one of the classrooms in UTD, and some of my students may show up, so I need to maintain the protocol, and I'm gonna keep my mask. Hopefully you can listen to me okay. I have a microphone. So I'm gonna start with my presentation, and I'm gonna require a PowerPoint. So I'll share the screen with you. All right. Do you see it okay? Yes, thank you so much. All right, so before I begin, I need to clarify at least 4 points. This is not gonna be the account of multiple events associated with state-sponsored violence or dictatorships. I'm using here memory as something that is a specific product associated with some exercise or the experience of social engineering. In other words, the indicator of a presence of state violence that is alive, is current, is present, and not a thing of the past. So I'm gonna use the figure of the disappear in terms of the elimination of the body and its identity. I wanted to show the video by the dictator Videla. I'm not sure if this is gonna work. I don't wanna get into too much trouble here. But perhaps I can summarize, since earlier I was having issues with the audio. What he says, and he argued, is that a disappeared person is not alive, is not dead, is just absent. That means it's a no presence And that may seem really obvious, but when the person is not in this plane of life, there cannot be closure. It remains as a permanent wound, not only for their families, but for the rest of society. And that's going to be probably the main a cardinal point in my presentation today, the figure of the disappeared. A second clarification that I would like to do is that disappearance is a tool and a technology of power. When I use this type of language, I don't want to be flashy, I don't want to be modern. It's just that that's the way I think describes the best a mechanism that once it's activated, it gains momentum and remains very harmful throughout the decades. Through this technology, those in power can create, destroy, or reorganize the social relationships. Those tools also destroy and modify identity. Let's remember that identity was central in the thought of Raphael Lemkin. It also influences the ways in which social groups construct their identity. And that is precisely what I'm using the word memories. Because once society has been touched by either genocide, mass violence, and the associated tools such as disappearances, kidnappings, and torture, that construction is going to take place in very different terms. It also, of course, defines the otherness of the other, which is to say that the sovereignty of the people in power become an imposition on those who do not have the same strength or the same political power. It also establishes a visible link between oppressed and the oppressor. And we're gonna be giving some examples of this. The third clarification is that I'm gonna be exploring somehow a cartography of how these technologies occur within a certain environment. And I like the approach by a philosopher. She's Mexican, she lives at the border in Tijuana. She proposes this character, the endriago. The endriago is the result of a radical subjectivity and a product of what she calls gore capitalism. Gore capitalism is a branch of capitalism that requires the spectacle of blood that is not only a visual tool, but something that becomes a merchandise, something that acquires value and can be traded and produce a lot of wealth quickly, produce a lot of money and accumulation. It's also the crystallization of hegemonic masculinity. That is to say that it encompasses a geopolitical problem of gender, race, and social class. Now, if we look at this from the perspective of decolonial studies and we understand the difference between a colonial force and the colonized, then we know that those usually called subalterns are confronted with all these forces and they just cannot comply with that. So that crystallization of that hegemonic masculinity occurs in very difficult terms that creates an impossibility of compliance. And of course, and this is the logical thought to have after this, is that non-compliance can extend to the area or the field of consumerism, understood as hyper-consumerism, which requires the naturalization of violence. Oh, and just a footnote, that you are looking at here is the representation of Amadis de Gaula, who was a hero in the 16th century's novelas de caballería, chivalry novels, who is a antagonist to this, the Endriago, which is a mythological figure, half hydra and half dragon. This monster inhabits the hell and imposes his terror and his ways on the people around him. So it was necessary that a mythical confrontation to rid humanity of such a evil entity. So Saya Valencia gets inspired on that character, and I'll tell you more in a little while. The fourth clarification is that this leads us to somehow have a perspective from a very defined space, usually at a border, in a frontier, in which an episteme of violence is going to prevail. And what that does is that usually produces something that Valencia calls necro-empowerment, which is the added value to the destruction of the bodies. It obliterates community ties in the social fabric. In other words, what we are in front of is the fabrication of a commodity that we can understand simply as blood. We are usually comfortable thinking that time is money. In this epistemic setting, blood is money. Is that blunt? Is that violent? And it's also relatively simple. Bodies, blood become beyond the spectacle, beyond the news, beyond the publicity, become money and wealth very fast for a lot of people. This picture that I'm showing you here is not the army. This is a cartel. They have brand new trucks, brand new uniforms, military training. They have all kinds of hierarchy categories within their organizations, and they usually function in places and ways in which the state should be functioning. So they run parallel somehow to the state, not only in Mexico, but in many other countries. That's it. Those four main components of the presentation are going to help us understand that when we talk about state-sponsored violence, we're usually meaning a process of reorganizing society. I guess the paradigmatic case is Germany and their Nazi Volksgemeinschaft, which was the people's community. It existed before the Nazi period. However, during the Nazi era, we see that acquires very specific racial tones, right? In the case of Argentina, we see that is called process of national reorganization. So no euphemism there. Is very straightforward. The intentions are clear, and that was why I was going to show you the Videla video, his recording explaining why people who are disappeared do not represent a problem for him, because if there's no body, there's no evidence, and if there's no evidence, there's no crime, and nothing can be done for that person. He openly said that. All right. So why am I doing this? Well, I'm trying to recover all those elements that I just told you to associate them with a process that allows the emergence of this violence in the present. As Daniel Firestein said, genocide's purpose is not the kill, is not the immediate death of the enemy, the elimination. That has been a discourse that we hear a lot over the years. He says that the problem with some of the contemporary approaches to genocide is the disregard of the beginning of the process way back before the killing events, and then the dismissal of the everlasting effects in society. So in in the case of Mexico, at least we can go back to the creation of the party that became hegemonic in political and economic terms as well. They regulated the access to a very exclusive uh, club of people who were going to be in charge of the development of uh, economic policy in Mexico. It's not that they created them, but they somehow allowed the flow in certain ways uh, into their advantage. That's what it was called a corporatist party. So what we see is after the revolution, with the all the factions, post-revolutionary factions, there was a need to consolidate, stop the fighting, create a central organization. That is what the PNR was in 1928. By 1938, a decade later, the same party became the PRM, which was a response to the zeitgeist, which at the time was associated with some type of a socialistic ideal, especially promoted by the president Lázaro Cárdenas. It was a moment of populism in which the aspiration was to provide certain representation to all sectors in society, meaning labor, peasants, unionized professionals, etc. By 1946, and as a response to the post-war economy and political situation, especially the Cold War, the party becomes the PRI that we know nowadays. And that's when it becomes hegemonic and it does not accept any kind of political resistance. It becomes harder, even harder on its opponents. So something to bear in mind is that the creation of this political party that defines the Mexican political system, which is different from the political regime, because the regime institutionally is democratic, but the system is a different thing, is related with military groups. Of course, the world economy, I just mentioned that, very important, the US foreign policy, local elites, and corporate entities. By the 1950s, we see that those corporate entities, understood as the co-opted segments of society within the hegemonic organization of the PRI, become restless because they see that they have the opportunity to demand more and to claim their rights. Economic situation is changing. So we see restlessness in the Mexican society. A few examples is the strikes by nurses, physicians, which immediately get categorized as subversives. And not only them, we can talk about the railroad workers, the teachers in the unions, unionized factory workers, etc. In the 1960s, and in the threshold of what is basically a disaster in the terms that I'm going to mention in a couple of minutes, we see that the desire of Mexico is to project an image of modernity, organization, industrialization, and more than anything, no problems. A very homogeneous nation that has one focus. That is at least the official discourse, right? And the emblematic case is represented by the Mexico 1968 Olympic Games, which was a very large project at the time that was gonna somehow culminate the construction of that modern image of Mexico before the rest of the world. Things were not smooth. And what was a confrontation between high school students escalated because of the repression and because of the response by the government into a massive student movement that demonstrated for some days before the Olympic Games. The result was a very violent repression, and that was October the 2nd, 1968. A lot of people were hurt, some were killed, some disappeared, but probably that is the beginning of something that became a trend, which is the use of torture, which was not new at the time, and disappearances. That's when we probably can see that the meaning of the disappearance is somehow translated to the eyes of society as an exemplary punishment, as a way of saying this is going to happen to you if you are one of these subversives, right? Regardless of their affiliation, regardless of activity, regardless of their profession. Most of them were students and professors, workers, but there was bystanders who were caught in between. Now, in the case of Argentina, we see that they suffered, and I'm just looking at the 20th century, a number of military interventions, which had been defined as a Praetorian way of combining civilian and military power. So it doesn't just mean that military power takes over civilian, but that they can coordinate and rule together. My interest here is to look at the last one, which is the 1976 to 1983. Those in the past were somehow building a culture in which the use of violence, it was okay to resolve any kind of a national issue. By the time we see the last dictatorship, that was pretty much normalized, at least in the heads of those who were in power. It was okay to do it. This is the military junta. It's not a homogeneous group. Videla, Rafael Videla, was the president of the junta, and he got the help of Eduardo Macera y Orlando Agosti. All of them represent different corporations within the military, Navy, Army, Air Force. The purpose is to somehow stabilize the country, because the country at that time was in a state of, according to them, alert because of the revolutionary activities by a few groups were armed and violent. They had different ideologies. They had different ways of claiming that justice was needed in the country at that time. However, the unified discourse, it was that the total war against subversives was something justified, because it was a way to say that a mandatory cleansing of the body politic was the only solution to that particular stain, preventing the country from doing its best to move forward into modernity, open markets, productivity, civilization. One of the components within the military dictatorship was the creation of detention centers, which imply the resignification of what would be a regular world for regular citizens. What that means is that, and this is a case from a movie based on real events, the Garage Olimpo, but like the Garage Olimpo, we see many examples. The School of Engineering, La Perla, many others that function in a way of a concentration camp and torture facilities. The resignification resides in the fact that the kidnapped people were taken into these facilities, and what it in the past worked as a regular car shop now is a center in the preamble to death. One of the lines that I got from the movie, which is shocking, is that a lady who happens to be a activist of some sort is detained. She's taken into this place, and the policeman in charge of her tells her, "This is the world. This is the world of sound for you. From now on, you will never see again. And if you see anything, I'm gonna rip your eyes out using a spoon." And then she was taken into the surgery room in which they had music. They had a picana, which was an invention of the dictatorship, which is the electrical rod to electrocute people in torture. And they had the charts because this kind of torture was medicalized. They had to read the weight of the person in order to give the appropriate voltage. There was a doctor looking just in case they passed out. The doctor was making sure they could be reanimated somehow. But at the end, and after complying with the information that the torturers require, whatever that was, they were sedated and they were taken to meet their own death. This is another example in which a school, engineering school, became a center of torture. And like I was saying, the conclusion is that they were taken into a ride over the Rio de la Plata to be thrown and forever disappeared. Now, those ways of applying torture, of disposing of the bodies, of repressing the citizens can be associated, like I said at the beginning, with a certain type of memory understood as how we deal with this information, how we resignify it, how we preserve it, how we remember those who are not here, but we cannot grieve because we haven't found their bodies. According to Daniel Firestein, genocide is also a symbolic enactment. If the overreaching purpose of genocide is to transform social relationships within any given society, it's not sufficient to kill those who act and think differently. The disappearance is not oblivion, so it's not only about forgetting those and leaving them behind, those who were killed in those circumstances. It is the pious pretense that genocide is irrational and inexplicable. That is what I am proposing, this different approach to this cartography. Not only retelling the events, because that could lead us easily to a very descriptive situation in which we think that the horror of the dictatorship, the horror of the disappearance, the horror of genocide and mass violence is just abnormal. It's just an accident. It's just a bump in the logic of history. In order to do that, we then need to look at what is it that the society is doing in terms of that memory and that reclaiming the space in order to find justice. Now, I'm not going to mention closure. A lot of people mention that, but there cannot be closure in this situation, and we know that. So one of the groups that emerged within the course of the military dictatorship is the Madres and Abuelas de la Plaza de Mayo. Those groups were in open resistance to the regime. They were talking to the reporters from the outside, foreigner reporters, diplomats, etc. They did not comply with the ways in which the social fabric was being torn and broken and aggravated somehow. Now, the big picture requires us to think in terms that are not only a dichotomy. So we need to understand that behind all this violence, there was more than only political power. At that time, and associated with the Argentinian dictatorship, there's neoliberal measures. The very own Minister of Economy, Jose Martinez de Hoz, used to say that reducing the state is in reality invigorating the nation. His family was a really wealthy family, old family. His great-grandfather acquired a lot of land in Argentina, and I'm talking about something like 2.5 million hectares in the 19th century. So that's the kind of power that landowners had at the time, but it became somehow embedded in their memory, the way of doing business, to the extent that after the Peronista era, which was considered populist and had certain had gained benefits for the laborers and unions and everything that represented the popular sectors, the neoliberal setting tried to dismantle that. So that's when we see the argument of reducing the state and liberating the market. Of course, that was the companion, the speech that went along with the Cold War, with the national security doctrines, because it didn't just happen in one country, it happened in several countries, and also implied the eradication of political opponents tagged as socialist and communist. That was the dichotomy producing this kind of violence. The parallel, the common area that somehow becomes visible and illuminated when we talk about the displacement of that power from the political sphere into the economic sphere, tied together with a very singular discourse, identifiable, not hidden discourse, will also allow us to see that this is in Max Weber terms, the monopoly of violence has been displaced as well. So we cannot expect to see that displacement in what we usually think as political institutions and not see it anywhere else. So the monopoly of violence has been displaced since the reduction of the state implies not only the size, but the strength. So one thing is a reduced state, another thing is a weak state. It usually goes hand in hand, but when a weak state confronts this type of setting, in socioeconomic term, that displacement allows that economy to engage in a bidding process. And somehow, lately, at least in the past 3 decades, the higher offer has been placed by organized crime. And something that I thought it was interesting and that could help is that Forbes here had included in 2013 El Chapo Guzman, the leader of the Sinaloa cartel, as one of the billionaires who happened to be self-made, right? They describe their, well, his wealth estimated in billions. They call him a CEO. So it's like he was accepted within the logic of this wild accumulation of capital as one of the guys. Now, one of the big issues that comes with that somehow normalization of violence and the job performed by the Endriagos that we see throughout the history from the 1970s to the 2000s, is that it creates this environment which is really good for the exercise of this massive violence. In the case of Mexico, it was done in the setting of a dirty war fought against the subversives in terms of the guerrillas, the Marxist guerrillas in the Sierras, unionized people, people in the far left, etc. Then we see something similar in the 1990s with the feminicides. And then in the 2000s, 2006, the war on drugs initiated formally by President Calderon. What these have in common is the rhetoric of the market, and that we should not lose from our sights. Like I said, this is a era of the discourse of capitalism and democracy versus Marxism and communism. Then here we see the welfare state versus neoliberal trends, specifically 1994, when the NAFTA becomes effective. And in the 2000s, we see the war on drugs that is already tied to a process of looking at global issues under the light of global terrorism and the war against something very abstract. Now, one of the examples that I like to show you as a continuation of this displacement, this new relationship between the market, the political system, the erasure of boundaries, but at the same time, the creation of spaces which are borders, allow us to see that this new modality is becoming, well, very normalized. I'm sorry, I'm running out of breath because of the mask. The state of Veracruz is a state in the Gulf of Mexico, a very wealthy state, oil, many other resources. And the last two governors have been what I define as crossover governors. That is a political figure that exercises political power legitimately because they win elections, And then they have a parallel series of illegal activities. In other words, they are also like capos, like leaders of organized crime cells. And during their terms, we have seen, and this is almost like a rule of thumb, thousands of lives of people who were killed and disappeared, the increase in insecurity, violence, and impunity. They think that no one is going to be able to touch them. And the use of repression and force under the excuse of the war on drugs. So this discourse is a two-way street. It appeals to the mind in two different ways. One, good versus evil, and then again, evil versus something evil as well. In this context as well, the police have assumed a license to kill or disappear, the army as well. We need to understand that sometimes when they do this, it's not only because of political reasons, but because they are somehow in the payroll of one cartel or the other. If you get a chance, Charles Bowden does a very good X-ray description of how this takes place in cities like Ciudad Juarez, when he witnessed how the army was offering their protection to cartels and other criminal organizations, which is really common. I mean, all you need to do is Google it, and it's not a secret. You see federal police, army, that represents some kind of an infection within the own institution, because then again, some people are not like that. So they are truly risking their lives, not only confronting the criminals, but their own fellow police officers or army officers. We see this kind of violence in rural and urban areas. The authorities collude with the organized crime, and youth happen to be the largest group victimized. That is the perspective of identity imposition, right? Young people are prone in this logic to be members of the cartel, which statistically may be a reality, but it's not something that should be generalized. Like in the case of the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, we see examples like this, Marisela Escobedo, who fought against the system because her daughter was disappeared. She knew who disappeared her daughter. She was doing investigation work to find the killer. She found him, and at the end, she was killed by the cartel. She appealed to the governor of Chihuahua. She appealed to numerous authorities in Mexico, federal, state level. She demonstrated, and as you can see, there's only a handful of people demonstrating with her. So that is another way in which I see that the fracture of the social fabric has expressions, the lack of solidarity, the lack of responsibility, the belief in the fact that those who become victims need to be bad people all the time, and they somehow had it coming. All right, in terms of the effects on society, we can see that at least most people, and these are statements that I got from one of the current activists in Mexico. Her name is Lucia Diaz. She works mainly in Veracruz. Her son was disappeared, and what she put together is here in front of you. According to her, most people has not a precise idea of the reality of the disappearances, even though we're talking about thousands. They only have abstract knowledge of the issue. The authorities have done a good job stigmatizing the victims. Civil society believes in the pattern. And obviously this is one of the consequences of that fracture. This is her and her group of mothers. They all had been victims. And what they do is they locate or try to locate the bodies with dignity, right? Because that's something that the government, the state doesn't want to do. So just to give you an idea, I show you this from her PowerPoint. This is a very fancy gated community, and they have found mass graves, illegal mass graves here, side by side. That's the normalization of that type of horror. As well, another example is that in Mexico, last year, they found 559 clandestine mass graves. And since 2006, which is that point of departure that I mentioned a few minutes ago, they have counted at least 4,000 mass graves, and about 6,900 human bodies have been recovered. Of course, Lucia talks about staggering numbers, 300,000 people missing, around half a million people already dead in the war on drugs. There's no specific numbers, there's no reliable numbers because the official numbers are very high, but reality tells us that the accurate figures are very high. So when I do mention memories, I'm advocating for the resignification of the term. And that means to leave behind this Manichaean discourse in which we confront two antagonist groups. So I'm talking about dictatorships versus subversives, democratic versus undemocratic, civilized versus barbarous or barbarians. We also need to start thinking, that there's some kind of a force of good here that is fighting all the time this force of evil here that happens to be a subaltern, right? The other that is the barbarian, the one who is never going to be civilized, the undemocratic, etc. Things are more complex than that. And just to give you an idea of how that affects us and how that is necessary and important to understand the whole situation beyond the reduction of dichotomies alone, I wanted to show you this. And please pay attention to the numbers of the billions of dollars that can be made in illegal businesses. So this is to confirm and to somehow support that the regular economy, regular business cannot be detached and just be separated from the fact that already an important segment of global businesses are related with this type of very dark activity. As long as we do that, we are not going to be able to solve the problem. We are going to be stigmatizing the victims and probably throwing more fire into the fire. The reform needed in the way in which we look at these problems need to be based in the experiences of authoritarian regimes, their tools like kidnapping, disappearances, and the way in which this gore capitalism demands the splashing of blood that means making money in a very easy way. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to have a conversation with you right now.
Thank you very much, Pedro. While we give everyone an opportunity to type up any comments or questions that they may have, I would like to call everyone's attention to a message that I put into the chat that has a link to our website that has our upcoming events. We hope that you're able to join us for one or more of those. One of which is the third of this lecture series that will be given by Dr. Sarah Valente, and she's going to talk on April 28th at 4 p.m. on the Holocaust and dictatorship in Brazilian literature. So now we've got some comments thanking you for your presentation. Dr. Hone says, thank you. Great presentation. Maria Lofton says, thank you. The market seems to demand stability as instability is bad for business. Given the brutal tactics applied by both criminal and state actors upon Mexican citizens, is instability inevitable? Or is the stability of the market too dependent on violence to maintain itself?
That is a good question. Thank you. The new mechanics of doing business allow to see bodies as minds. So what we call stability now has changed. For them, it's a permanent state of war in which the body is not only a way of extracting some kind of wealth, but also the vessel for a message. It serves different purposes. And that's what we see in the cases of torture and then the elimination of the person. It's not about gaining information. It's not about teaching a lesson to that person. It's about then using their body to send a message. And the message of the disappearance in the dictatorship was different from the message of the disappearance in a mass grave with thousands of others. However, in some cases, it can be really clear because literally they type messages and tie them to the bodies. They hang people from bridges. They send severed heads to politicians or other cartel members. So it serves a dual purpose. The normalization of that terror, the change in social practices, the change of the networks of support, the delegitimation of human rights fighters. So it serves a very large conglomerate of interests and purposes. I guess stability in these terms has changed because we are talking about a different way of doing business, which is hybrid, by the way. It's hybrid because it has very close ties with regular enterprises. And it follows their protocols to the extent that, you know, Forbes considered El Chapo a CEO, right? That is symbolic, I understand. But if you look at the structure of criminal organizations, the definition of criminal organized crime in Mexico is defined as the division of work and labor. So it can be judged and punished if members of that organization divide the work in similar terms like do regular businesses. That is the definition. So that is telling us a lot. So that has changed. But the main message is probably do not interfere because this is going to happen to you. That has been the message since the 19th century, using those type of small placards attached to the body saying, don't do this or you're going to end up like this.
So the way that you ended that question, it's almost like you knew what I was about to ask next. The other question is, and sorry, the chat's jumping, so it's hard to keep up. Do you think the situation will change for the better in the feasible future?
I don't think so, because it requires us to change our perspectives and to see beyond the dichotomy good and evil. It requires us to see that the human body has become a merchandise, that there's money to be made out of blood, that this is a gender problem, not only in the terms of men and women, male, female, but a problem of the imposition of certain roles. The ambitions of most of these men have one purpose, to be able to express their virility and masculinity as providers for their families, as dominating males over other males. So if we don't see that, if we don't see the effects of that gender role imposition, very difficult we'll see any kind of results. The narcocultura, which is really popular and involves, the typical Mexican macho and bravado and all that, does not provide all the answers. We need to see that some of these people are really sophisticated. They have spectacular mansions that have nothing to do with the typical drug dealer style. They travel, they send their kids to private school. So if we don't see that tie, I don't see any kind of a resolution in the near future. It takes a lot of effort.
Another question is, and piggybacking off of that, is there any part of the United Nations or another international agency that could deal with some of these acts of terrorism?
Well, yeah, there's a numerous groups and observatories, and they produce reports, fantastic reports. And that has been their job, since, decades ago. I mean, just to give you an example, I don't know, Amnesty International produced some reports on human rights abuses in the 70s. They were awarded the 1977 Peace Nobel Prize. But before that, the prize was awarded in economy to Milton Friedman, right? So yes, there's people looking. The problem is that enforcement tend to be weak, influenced by politics, but also on the other hand, we see the lack of participation, lack of civil initiatives to be involved and to demand. That's what I show you the examples of the Madres in Argentina and Marisela Escobedo in Mexico and Lucia Diaz. They recover the space, retailor the discourse of rights, but there's more help needed in that regard.
Mhm. Another question is, how much more difficult is it to resolve the cases of enforced disappearances in Mexico, especially when we're talking about this hybrid form of mass violence, not emanating from one centralized source, as was the case of the military junta in Argentina?
I think it's very difficult and almost impossible because you have so many private agents doing this, right? I mean, it's not just a centralized group, right? It doesn't mean that it was homogeneous in Argentina, but the protocol was really clear, and there's something called ambiguity, right? You may have a perpetrator that we can kind of define, but the ambiguity in terms of who's going to be the victim allows genocide to be something obscured, if you will, because not all the victims have a profile. And that applies to the Argentinian case, but also to this contemporary case in Mexico. It can happen to anyone. That's what I'm trying to say. So because of that, it would be really difficult to see any kind of progress, either finding them or fighting them, right?
And then we've got one last question because we are at the top of the hour. Calderon waged war, and it seems like Peña Nieto and López Obrador administrations are in negotiations with the cartels. After López Obrador, what do you think Distrito Federal administration can do to lessen or bring some sort of light at the end of the tunnel? And thank you for your presentation.
All right. Oh, that's complicated. the fact that we see this violence in 2006 is because, and this is a thesis that I get from other scholars, experts in the subject, is that there was a polarization of the fight. So it was not like the forces of good and the military were fighting against these evil organizations. The military took sides with certain groups, and that diminished the rival groups. So what we see is that negotiation sometimes means making money, making alliances, but sometimes it just means like, this is beyond our control. It's a global situation, so do not interfere with the every day activities of regular citizens. We have seen examples of this. They have been highly criticized because they give the impression of a weak government and weak military. However, I think the consideration of lives who get caught in between the fight it needs to be significant. It needs to be really meaningful. After all, you know, catching the high-profile bosses is like the Hydra, right? You cut a head and you get 3 more. That's what Sayek Valencia uses the comparison with the character of the Endriagos. There's a lot of them competing. It's business. That is the parallel, the analogy with regular business, right? You open up business in one part, that's going to extend to the rest, whether it's illegal or illegal. Lack of regulation has those effects, right? There's no defined frontier.
Well, thank you. I hope everyone else will join me in virtual applause or actual applause or every other way to say thank you very much for this presentation. And again, if anyone has any questions, I put my email in the chat. You're welcome to reach out to me. And this is recorded and we will be sending this out, and it will also be on our website in the future. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.